Since my wife's passing, my world had shrunk to the tick and tock of my clocks. Order, precision. It was the only way I could keep the grief from shattering me completely. But a sound that didn't belong, the harsh scrape of a chain, broke the rhythm. She was chained to my workbench, a wild spirit amidst my delicate machines. My shock turned to cold dread as I saw the words carved into the heart of my sacred workspace, a message that turned my grief into terror for those who steal. The town of Serenity Flats was a place of straight lines and hard truths, but for me, Klaus Richter, it was a ghost. Every dusty street corner held a memory of my Lena, her laughter echoing in the silence she had left behind. For 2 years I had retreated into the only world that still made sense, the world of gears and springs, of time measured and contained. My workshop was a sanctuary, a fortress of brass and polished wood built to keep the chaos of loss at bay. Each morning I would wind the grandfather clock in the corner, a task Lena used to call the town's heartbeat. But her heart had stopped, and now so had mine. The ticking was just a hollow echo. The first light of dawn was just beginning to bleed through the grimy panes of my workshop window, painting the millions of floating dust motes in strokes of brilliant gold. This was my favorite time, the quiet hour, where the only sounds were the gentle symphony of my creations. 100 tiny hearts of brass, all beating in perfect, predictable time. It was the only peace I had left. That peace was shattered by a sound so alien, so discordant, it felt like a crack in the very glass of reality. It was not the soft click of an escapement wheel or the whir of a mainspring. It was a dull, metallic scrape, a sound of heavy, brutal iron. I froze. A tiny brass beer held in my tweezers, my breath caught in my throat. I told myself it was the wind, perhaps a loose shutter on the general store next door. In my experience, the mind plays tricks when it is weighed down by sorrow. But then it came again, followed by a soft, almost imperceptible sound of a sharp intake of breath. A sound that was undeniably human. Someone was in my workshop. My blood ran cold. Thieves were not uncommon, but they were usually clumsy, loud. This was different. This felt personal. I placed the gear down on a velvet cloth with a hand that did not feel like my own and rose slowly from my stool. The floorboards, which I knew like the lines on my own palm, gave a familiar groan. My gaze swept across the ordered chaos of my benches, the delicate tools, the half-assembled clock faces that stared up at the ceiling like sightless eyes. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet the feeling of violation was overwhelming. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, chaotic rhythm that had no place in this temple of precision. I moved toward my main workbench, the heavy oak table that had been my father's and his father's before him in the old world. It was the heart of this place, the altar upon which I practiced my craft. As I rounded a tall regulator clock, I saw it, and the world, the carefully constructed world of ticking and order, simply fell apart. She was chained to my workbench. A girl, no, a young woman, surely no more than 20 summers. She was Sue, her features proud and short, even under a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She was bound to the thick leg of the table with a heavy iron manacles and chain, the kind I'd seen used for prisoners or animals. Her buckskin dress intricately beaded, had been aggressively torn down the front, the raw edges of the leather frankly exposing the soft, shadowed skin of her cleavage. She wasn't fighting the chain, but sat with a stillness that was more defiant than any struggle. Her dark eyes, full of the fire that grief had long since extinguished in my own, locked onto mine. There was no fear in them, only a fierce, untamed pride that seemed to mock the very iron that held her captive.
For a moment, I could not breathe. It was not just the shock of finding a person in my sacred space, but the sheer impossibility of it. How had she gotten here? Who could have done this? My workshop was my life, a place where the greatest intrusion was a clumsy customer or a gust of wind. This was a desecration. My eyes darted from her face to the chain, then to the unforgivable gouges in the surface of my workbench. Freshly carved into the wood, a cruel scar upon generations of craftsmanship, were the words. 4 words that turned my shock into a cold, creeping dread that coiled in the pit of my stomach. For those who steal. The implication was as clear as it was monstrous. They, whoever they were, had not just put her here. They had framed me. Me, Klaus Richter, a man whose only remaining virtue was the honesty of his work. I felt the surge of rage, so foreign and hot it nearly made me dizzy. How dare they? How dare they violate my home, my work, and use this young woman as a tool for their twisted justice? "Who did this to you?" I whispered, my English thick with my German accent. My voice sounded thin, a stranger's in the quiet room. The woman's expression did not change. She simply watched me, her gaze unblinking, assessing. It was clear she either did not understand me or did not trust me enough to answer. After all these years, I've learned that trust is a fragile, delicate mechanism, easily broken and difficult to repair. My anger gave way to a profound pity, not just for her, but for the shared violation of this space. She was a captive, and in a way, so was I, chained to a crime I did not commit. I reached for my tools, my hands moving with the practiced grace of a surgeon. "I will get you out of this," I said, more to myself than to her. The manacle was thick, the lock a crude, brutal thing. It was not one of mine. It would take time to pick, time I was suddenly aware I did not have. The sun was climbing higher, and soon the town of Serenity Flats would begin to stir. The baker would fire his oven, the stable hand would start his chores, and Sheriff Miller would begin his morning patrol. My workshop had a large front window, a window for displaying my finest clocks, my proudest achievements. Now it was a liability, a stage upon which my ruin would be displayed for all to see. I had to work fast. I selected a set of fine steel picks from my drawer. This was a delicate operation. One clumsy move, one slip of the hand, and I could injure her. She watched my every move, her expression a careful mask of neutrality. But I saw the slight flinch when my hand came close to her wrist. She was afraid. Of course she was afraid. Her pride was a shield, but behind it was a young woman in a terrifying and helpless position. I thought of Lena, how she would have handled this. She would not have hesitated. She would have been full of fire and compassion, her voice a ball of fury all at once. "Some things are just plain wrong, no matter how you look at it," she used to say, her moral compass as true and unwavering as the northern star. Seeing this girl, so fierce and so vulnerable, felt like a test of the man Lena had loved. I would not fail it. I would not fail her. "Hold still," I murmured, my voice softer this time. "Ik werde der nicht windtoon. I will not hurt you." As my picks probed the lock, the world outside began to wake up. The distant clatter of a milk wagon, a crow of a krukaha. Each sound was a hammer blow against the fragile silence, a tick of a clock counting down to my discovery. My hands, usually so steady, began to sweat. The lock was stubborn, its mechanism gritty and unfamiliar. It resisted my efforts, a small iron tyrant mocking my skill. She remained unnervingly still, her breathing the only sound besides my frantic work and the chorus of clocks around us. Then a new sound cut through the morning air, a sound that made my heart stop. Heavy, measured footsteps on the boardwalk outside. They were slow, authoritative, unmistakable. It was Sheriff Miller. And the footsteps were slowing, stopping. They were right outside my door. A sharp, heavy rap echoed through the workshop, rattling the very glass in the window frames. Every clock in the room seemed to fall silent. All I could hear was the frantic pounding of my own blood in my ears. He was here, now. The trap was sprung. There was no time. In a single, desperate motion, I grabbed a heavy canvas tarp, the one I used to cover my most delicate projects, and threw it over the workbench, concealing the girdle and the damning evidence completely. I took a shaky breath, trying to compose myself, to erase the terror from my face. The doorknob prattled. He was letting himself in.
Sheriff Miller filled the doorway, his broad frame blocking the morning light. He was a man built of lard and suspicion, his silver badge the only thing about him that truly shone. His small piggy eye swept the workshop, lingering on the bulky shape of the canvas tarp. A silent question hung in the air, thick and heavy. I knew that one wrong move, one flicker of fear in my eyes, and he would tear this place apart. My survival and the girls depended on the next 60 seconds. Years of containing my grief had taught me to build walls within myself. I retreated behind them now, praying they were strong enough. "Morning, Klaus," he grunted, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Starting early today, or did you not sleep at all?" His gaze was sharp, probing for a weakness. The townspeople treated me with a distant pity, but Miller saw my reclusive nature as something unnatural, something to be watched. "A difficult project requires a steady hand, Sheriff," I replied, my voice remarkably even. I gestured vaguely toward a complex clock movement on a nearby stand. "This piece, it requires a silence the daytime does not afford." He took a step inside, his boots thudding on the floorboards. Each step was a physical blow, a tightening of the knot in my gut. He sniffed the air. "Smells different in here today. Not just oil and sawdust." He walked closer to the draped workbench, his eyes narrowed. Beneath the canvas, I could hear nothing. She was holding her breath where he would have heard it. The sheer discipline of her stillness was astounding. It was the only reason we had a chance. "Some kind of new varnish?" he asked, his hand reaching out toward the canvas. Panic seized me. My mind raced, searching for a plausible lie. "Oxalic acid," I said, the words coming out sharp and fast, "for cleaning a brass movement that is tarnished. The fumes, they are quite potent. It is why I have it covered, to contain them." Miller's hand paused, hovering just inches from the top. He hated anything he didn't understand, and chemical processes were a mystery to him. It was a gamble, but it was the only one I had. He grunted again, a sound of reluctant acceptance, and pulled his hand back. "Well, see that you air the place out. Wouldn't want you passing out in here and setting the town ablaze." He turned his attention away from the bench, his gaze falling upon the cruel gouges in the wood next to it, the carved words I hadn't had time to conceal. "What in God's name happened here?" My heart felt like it had stopped. He pointed a thick finger at the words. "For those who steal. Looks like a threat, Klaus. You have something to tell me?" I had to force the story out, a painful mix of truth and fabrication. Some drunkards last night," I said, rubbing my temples as if nursing a headache. "They tried to break in through the back. I chased them off before they could take anything, but they left their mark." I made my voice bitter, violated. In their foolishness, they seemed to think I was the one who stole from them. It was a thin story, full of holes, but in a town like this, drunken vandalism was more believable than a chained Sioux healer. In my experience, people believed the simplest explanation, not the truest one.
Miller considered it, chewing on the inside of his cheek. The silence stretched, each tick of the clocks a countdown to my doom. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I'll ask around at the saloon, see who is causing trouble." He turned to leave, and I felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees. He was at the door when he stopped, one hand on the frame. "Strange," he said, not turning around. "For a man who says he chased off vandals, your hands don't have a single scratch on them. Good day, Klaus." The door clicked shut, leaving me in a silence that was louder and more terrifying than any noise. He knew. He didn't know what, but he knew I was lying. He had planted a seed of suspicion, and now he would wait to see what grew. I rushed back to the workbench and threw off the top. The girl's eyes were wide, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something other than pride in them. It was a shared fear, a fragile, unspoken alliance. "We do not have much time," I said, returning to the lock with renewed urgency. My hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the near discovery. The close call had sharpened my focus. The pins in the lock, which had felt so stubborn before, began to yield. I felt the slight give, the subtle click-click of the tumblers aligning, and then the final, satisfying snap. The manacle sprang open. I pulled it away from her wrist, revealing a raw red circle on her skin where the iron had chafed. For a moment, we both just stared at her freed hand. She flexed her fingers slowly, as if reacquainting herself with the concept of freedom. Her eyes then rose to meet mine, and in them was a complex mixture of gratitude, suspicion, and 1,000 unspoken questions. "I am Klaus," I said simply. "What is your name?" She hesitated, her gaze searching my face, my eyes looking for the trick, the price. Finally she spoke, her voice softer than I expected, yet strong. "They call me Wachiwi. It means dancing girl." Wachiwi. The name was beautiful, a stark contrast to her grim reality. "Wachiwi," I repeated. "You are safe now." But I knew as I said the words that they were a lie. Neither of us was safe. The town of Serenity Flats was small, its web of eyes and ears inescapable, and Sheriff Miller was a patient spider. I had freed her from the chain, but I had just trapped us both in a much larger, more dangerous cage. I had a fugitive in my workshop, a threatening message carved into my workbench, and the distrustful eye of the law upon me. "We need to get you away from here," I said, my mind already working on the logistics. "There is a creek a few miles north. The Apache camp there might—" She cut me off, her voice firm. "No." I was taken aback. "No? What do you mean, no? You cannot stay here." "The men who did this, they took something from me. A medicine pouch. It belonged to my grandfather. It is all I have left of him. I will not leave without it." My heart sank. This complicated everything. "Wachiwi, that is impossible. To go looking for it would be suicide. To leave without it is to leave my spirit behind," she replied, her conviction absolute. "It is in this town. I can feel it." I looked at her fierce determination on her youthful face,
and I saw a reflection of my own stubborn grief. I had clung to my workshop, to my clocks, to keep the memory of Lena alive. Her pouch was her clock. It was her connection to the past, the one thing that still ticked for her. And in that moment, my decision solidified. It wasn't just about saving her life anymore. It was about helping her reclaim her own. His dishonesty cost him more than money. It cost him his self-respect. My inaction now would cost me mine. "All right," I heard myself say, the words feeling both foolish and profoundly right. "All right, but you will do exactly as I say. This town is a dangerous place. Its people are not kind to outsiders." "I am not an outsider," she said with a cryptic intensity. "I was born in these hills. It is they who are the strangers." Before I could ask what she meant, a loud commotion erupted from the street outside. Shouts, the sound of a horse rearing in panic. I rushed to the window, peering cautiously through a crack in the curtains. My blood turned to ice. A crowd was gathering. In the center of it, Sheriff Miller was talking to two rough-looking men, trappers by the look of their buckskin clothes and hard, cruel faces, and one of them was pointing directly at my workshop. The faces of the trappers were a venomous mix of cheap whiskey and self-righteous fury. They were the ones. I knew it with a certainty that chilled me to the bone. They had put her here, carved the message, and now they had come to spring their trap with the town and its sheriff as their audience. This wasn't just a random act of cruelty, it was a performance, and I was to be the star. The law, in the hands of a man like Miller and fueled by a mob, was not a tool for justice, but a weapon. "They've come for you," I said, my voice low and urgent, not daring to look away from the window. "For us." Wachiwi moved to my side, her movements as silent as a shadow. She peered through the glass and her body went rigid. "The tall one," she whispered, her voice a low hiss of hatred. "His name is Silas. He is the one who took my pouch." The situation had gone from dangerous to catastrophic. The men who had framed me were now conferring with the man who was supposed to enforce the law. And the object Wachiwi refused to leave without was in the hands of our enemy. I saw the grim logic of their plan click into place like the gears of one of my clocks. They would accuse me of theft, of hiding a runaway Sioux. Miller, armed with his suspicion, would search my shop. They would find her. There would be no trial, no questions, just the swift, brutal justice of the frontier. "There is a cellar," I said, my mind racing, a small door behind the tall cabinet. "Go now." "I will not hide like a frightened rabbit," she declared, her pride a beautiful, terrible thing. "You will do as I say," I snapped, my fear turning to a harsh command. "I will not let them find you. I will not let them." I gripped her arm, my touch surprisingly firm. "You trusted me to free you from the chain. Now trust me to free you from this." Our eyes met, and in that moment, a desperate, unspoken pact was formed. Her defiant pride gave way to a flicker of trust, a small, fragile flame in the growing darkness. She gave a shingle-sharp nod and moved toward the back of the workshop, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. I watched until the small cellar door closed behind her, plunging the back of the room into shadow. Then I turned to face my own reckoning. I walked to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped out onto the boardwalk, closing it firmly behind me. I would not allow them to desecrate my workshop again. "Is there a problem, Sheriff?" I asked, my voice ringing with a calm authority I did not feel. I folded my arms across my chest, a simple act of defiance. The crowd quieted, their attention shifting to me. Miller, flanked by the two trappers, stepped forward. "A problem, Klaus. You could say that. He gestured to Silas. This man claims a valuable item of his was stolen last night, a medicine pouch of some native design. He believes you have it. The accusation hung in the air, putrid and false. Silas, the tall trapper, swaggered forward, his eyes full of malice. That's right. Saw you near our camp last evening, German, skulking in the shadows. A lie. I hadn't left my workshop in days, but it was his word against mine, and in this town I was the strange, grieving foreigner, the other. I thought of the traditional values my father taught me, that honesty was a man's true north. That is a lie, I said, my voice steady. I have not left this place. Then you won't mind if we take a look inside, Miller said, his hand already moving toward my door. No, I said. The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a hammer blow. The crowd murmured. This was unexpected. The quiet, reclusive clockmaker was showing steel. Miller's face hardened, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. That's my pouch and the savage who carries it, Silas suddenly roared, pointing, not at me, but past me, at the workshop window.
In my haste, in my focus on facing them down, I had made a terrible mistake. The cellar door, while hidden, did not latch from the inside. A thin sliver of light from the front window must have sliced through the darkness, and she, consumed by her own fury, must have peeked out. Silas had the eyes of a hawk. He had seen her. The trap, which I had so carefully tried to disarm, had just snapped shut. With a triumphant roar, Silas shoved past me and kicked the door open. The crowd surged forward, their curiosity turning to a hungry, righteous anger. "There she is!" another man shouted. I turned, my heart a cold stone in my chest. Wachiwi stood near the back of the workshop, no longer hiding, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, her eyes fixed on Silas. She had been discovered. We were finished. Miller drew his gun, the crowd closing in, the scene descending into a chaos of shouts and accusations. But in that moment of utter ruin, I felt a strange and profound clarity. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp resolve. They could take my life, but they would not take my integrity. Not today. Enough, my voice boomed, amplified by the acoustics of the workshop. The sound was so powerful, so full of command, it shocked even me. The crowd faltered. Miller paused, his gun wavering. "You seek a thief?" I declared, pointing a trembling but resolute finger at Silas. "Then look no further." I strode to my main workbench, to the scar they had carved into its surface. With the strength born of pure adrenaline, I braced myself and heaved, tipping the massive oak table onto its side with a thunderous crash that shook the entire building. The delicate tools and clock parts scattered like shrapnel. The crowd gasped. Beneath the workbench, pried loose from the floorboards, was a small, hidden compartment. It had been my father's secret place where he kept his most valuable tools, and inside it, plain as day, lay the medicine pouch. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Silas's face went white. He had outsmarted himself. In his haste to plant the girl of the message, he had needed a place to hide the pouch until he could find it on my person. He had found my father's hiding spot, thinking it the perfect place to stash it temporarily. He hid it there when he carved his threat, to be found later to seal my fate. The townspeople turned their eyes from me to Silas, their expressions shifting from accusation to suspicion. Miller, a man who followed the path of least resistance, looked at the trapper, his face a thundercloud. "Silas, you have some explaining to do." Silas, seeing the tide turn against him, made a fatal mistake. He lunged, not for the door, but for Wachiwi, grabbing her to use as a shield. But he underestimated her. She moved like lightning, twisting out of his grasp, her knee striking him hard in the groin. As he doubled over in pain, she ripped the medicine pouch from his belt. The second trapper drew a knife, but it was too late. The townsmen, who minutes before had been a mob ready for a hanging, now saw the truth. They saw a brutal kidnapper and a brave young woman. The blacksmith, a giant of a man, stepped forward and leveled the trapper with a single punch. Sheriff Miller, seeing his authority and the town's will aligned, finally acted, cuffing the writhing Silas. Justice, it turned out, was not always a straight line. Sometimes it was a complex mechanism full of hidden springs and unexpected turns. In the aftermath, as the sheriff dragged the men to the jail, Wachiwi stood clutching her pouch, her eyes shining with unshed tears. The community, once a threat, now offered a cautious, respectful distance. They had seen the truth, and their suspicion of me had been replaced by a grudging respect. Everyone deserves a second chance to make a first good impression. Wachiwi approached me. Her earlier fierceness softened into something else. Something I hadn't seen before. Gratitude. She held out her hand, not in a plea, but in an offering. I looked down and saw that she had retrieved the small brass gear I had been working on when this all began. She pressed it gently into my palm. "Thank you," she whispered. I looked from the gear in my hand to her face, and for the first time in 2 years, the ghost of my workshop felt a little more distant. The ticking of the clocks around us no longer sounded like a hollow echo of what I had lost. It sounded like a beginning, the steady, quiet, and perfectly measured beat of a second chance. The air was still smelled of oil and sawdust, but now there was something else in the air too, the faint, sweet scent of hope.